Welcome to the Haphazard Hobbyist, and in the first video on this channel I'd like to recreate the Pleasance Church from Red Dead Redemption 2. To start the project I begin by sketching out simple shapes on a 5mm sketch pad. I'm using a 1/72 scale figure to set out the basic scale of the model. When finished I've ended up with some basic shapes like this. These will make up the shell of the building. To create the shell of the building I'm using cardstock, which is like the stuff you find at the back of a sketchbook. To cut out the shapes I'm using a scalpel and I'm making sure to cut down gently and with multiple passes, otherwise you won't end up with a clean cut. Once all the shapes are cut out you end up with like a 2D puzzle, and to stick them together I'm going to use hot glue simply because I'm lazy. You can also use tacky glue or white glue, it doesn't make much of a difference other than the drying time. I'm putting a second bead of glue here to just reinforce the shell. And this is what the shell looks like when it's all glued together. Off camera I cut out a roof using thin packaging cardboard. And I'm just sticking the rest of the building together. Here I'm cutting out a square of XPS foam to use as the chimney. I did carve a brick pattern into it with a scalpel and a pencil, which you can see here. However the footage I got wasn't too good, so I've kept it out. To make the wood panelling for the walls I'm using balsa wood, which I'm cutting out here using the same technique as before. I'm using a wire brush to accentuate the wood grain in the wood. I'm just cutting out wooden panels now. I'm using tacky glue to stick them on. Once the wood is completely glued down, I'm brushing on a watered down PVA glue to make sure that the wood is completely solid. To create clean joints between the corners of the walls I'm using thin strips of balsa wood and just gluing them into the corners. Again using tacky glue. To add a further level of detail to the walls, I'm using a pin vise to make little nail holes. For the window ledges, I'm using again thin strips of balsa wood and just gluing them in with tacky glue. I'm also using thin packaging card again, just cut into a thin strip to add borders to the windows and make it look generally cleaner. Here I'm using the cutouts from the windows to make inserts to add further levels of details. Keeping cutouts like this is handy. because you don't need to measure anything. For these windows I'm using thin strips of packaging card just layered on top of each other. When cutting these things out you need to be careful because scalpels are extremely sharp. As you can see here, I've cut my finger. It wasn't too bad though, so don't worry. Packaging card is really good to add simple details that balsa wood can't do because of its thin quality. Here you can see I'm gluing the inserts in. I'm just using tacky glue once again. However, this time I did go back with some liquid super glue. Again, I'm just using thin strips of balsa wood to add further details to the windows. Finally, I'm getting to the point where I can glue the roof on and the model is starting to look somewhat good. To create the shingles for the roof, I'm using cereal box card and just cutting it into strips. Then cutting it down into shingles with scissors. Using tacky glue again, I'm just individually placing the shingles onto the model. It is very time consuming, but it does end up with a good result. In hindsight, I would have made the shingles a lot smaller, which would have made it even more time consuming, but it would have looked a lot better. Creating the final details now, I'm just making a little cross for the roof of the church. I'm just using matchsticks and super glue. And wire. And with this in place, the building is done. Apart from the painting. At first I decided to paint the whole building black to give it a solid base coat. My theory being I could build up colours on top of it. However, you'll see this didn't work and I changed my mind completely. I'm sponging on white here to give a dappled effect. When I decided that wasn't working out very good, I painted the whole building brown as if to strip it back to wood. I dry brushed on some lighter tones to enhance the wood grain, and I began to think, how am I going to create the effect seen in the game? I had to create a chip paint effect, and I had no clue for the longest time how I would do this, but then it dawned on me. Tank modelers do this all the time, with chipping medium. However, I don't have chipping medium, and I didn't want to buy any. So I went out and bought the cheapest hairspray I could find, and sprayed a layer onto the brown paint. Then I sprayed on a white rattle can primer, which you can see here now. Once you get to this point, you can just chip away the paint using water and a rough brush. However, because I use rattle can paint, isopropyl alcohol worked a little bit better at chipping. I think I ended up with a really good result on this. I'm just going back in with brown paints now to paint any exposed wood features. I try and use varied tones, which you'll be able to see better in this clip, just to add some variation to the wood. I go in with more of an overbrush of the first paint I poured, just to add a bit of a unification to the wood. Once the wood was overbrushed, I went in with the lighter tone with a light dry brush in, just to bring out any of the features. I'm painting the chimney with just a cheap red-brown paint. And going in with different tones for a few of the bricks to add some variation. To fill the mortar lines, I'm using cheap wall filler to do its intended purpose really, and wiping it down with a wet paper towel. For the drainage tube, I'm using the same red-brown paint, just watered down to add some sort of rust effect. I'm dabbing it away with my finger to give a bit of mottling. I do this on all the metal features. Once all the paint is done, it's time for a wash. I'm using black paint, just watered down with a little bit of dish soap, and I'm slavering it all over the building and wiping it down with a paper towel until I have my desired effect. To create the window panes, I'm just using some clear acrylic and painting on with a paint pen, then gluing it in with some tacky glue. And with that, the building's done, and I'm moving on to the base. I'm just hot gluing layers of different foams to a wooden base. I think it's used for painting, I'm not too sure. I trim down the overhang with a hot wire cutter just to give a clean edge to the piece. I then go in with a handheld hot wire to add some landforming. Here I'm creating a terrain paste using plaster, Mod Podge, paint and a bit of water. I want it to a consistency so I can brush it on and hide up the foam texture without it being too thick. To take away the brush strokes, I'm just dabbing it down with a sponge. Once the plaster's dry, I give the base a whole coat of brown paint. Once the paint's dry, I glue the building in permanently now. Once everything's glued down, I paint on a layer of PVA glue to put some dirt down. Real dirt this is. I go in with a coarse layer first to add some thick rots, and then I go in with a thin layer just to unify everything. I completely stuck the dirt down with watered down PVA glue. I'm gluing in some details here of graves. I just cut these out using balsa wood, and I'm gluing them in using tacky glue. To add greens to the piece, I'm using static grass. I don't know what colour, I just did it by eye. I think it's about 2mm, which looked okay with the scale. And I'm just adding it in random patches to make it look natural. Once the static grass is down, I'm going in with grass tufts all over the piece. And as a final touch, I'm adding coarse turf and fine turf to the roof and all around the ground. Finally, I add some flowers in front of one of the graves, and it's done. I'm really proud of how this piece ended up, and although it's not 100% game accurate, I think I replicated something that would be very recognisable. I would love to get your feedback on this video as it is my first. Any constructive criticism is welcomed in the comment section. You could also say something nice, please. Thank you for watching this video. Please consider subscribing and liking. I'm Jake, the haphazard hobbyist. Thank you for watching.